The first time Margaret Hale raised her voice to her husband, the bells of St. Olave's were tolling for dusk. Their iron notes drifted through the narrow streets of York, like a warning no one ever heeded until it was too late. Margaret stood at the hearth, hands dusted with flour, her breath sharp with words she had held back for 7 years. William sat at the table, boots still on, ale sour on his breath, counting coins that were not enough and never would be. "You sold the last sack of barley," she said, carefully at first. "The one meant for winter." William did not look up. "I did what I had to." "What you wanted," she replied. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous in Tudor England, certainty. "And now the children will go hungry." That was when he finally met her eyes. In another time, in another world, this might have been the beginning of a long, bitter argument and nothing more. But in the year of our Lord 1583, in a city governed by churchwardens, aldermen, and laws written by men who feared women's tongues more than famine, Margaret's words crossed an invisible line. "Mind yourself," William said quietly. She did not. Margaret had grown up listening to her mother swallow grief when her father drank away the rent, listening to priests preach obedience while their own households whispered of cruelty. Listening had kept her alive, but it had never made her free. And so, when William stood and struck the table hard enough to rattle the crockery, she spoke again. "You do not own my silence," she said. The words fell like sparks in dry straw. William's hand did not strike her. That mercy at least he granted. Instead, he reached for his cloak. "I'll not be shamed in my own house," he said. "You'll answer for this." Margaret laughed once, sharply. "To whom?" He paused at the door. "To the law." Only then did the weight of what she had done settle into her bones. Everyone in York knew the stories. Women dragged before the magistrates for being common scolds, for nagging, for correcting their husbands in public, for speaking too loudly, too often, or too boldly. Some were fined. Some were paraded to the streets tied to a cart, jeered by neighbors who feared becoming the next example. And some, those deemed stubborn, unrepentant, or dangerous, were fitted with iron. Margaret had seen it once, hanging on the wall of the Guildhall like a grotesque crown, the scold's bridle, an iron cage shaped at the head, with a cruel metal plate that pressed down on the tongue. It was said to silence lies. It silenced screams just as well. William returned with 2 men before the candles had burned low. One was a churchwarden, the other, a neighbor who had borrowed Margaret's bread in lean months and never repaid it. Neither met her eyes. "She's unruly," William said, "defiant. She speaks against me and my authority." Margaret wanted to protest, to explain, to remind them of the winter she had survived, the children she had buried, the obedience she had given until obedience became a kind of slow death. But she understood something then that chilled her more than fear. Explanations were still words, and words were the crime. They took her by the arms. The house she had scrubbed and warmed with her own labor seemed to recede as they pulled her into the street. Doors cracked open. Faces appeared, curious and cautious. No one spoke in her defense. Silence, she realized, was contagious. As they walked, Margaret's thoughts splintered. She remembered her mother's voice, low and urgent. A woman must learn when not to speak. She remembered laughing at that once, young and newly married, believing love made such warnings unnecessary. At the Guildhall, the air smelled of cold stone and old authority. The magistrate did not ask what had been said, only whether it had been said at all. "Yes," William answered for her. The man nodded. "And do you repent?" Margaret opened her mouth. She hesitated for the briefest moment, standing at the edge of a choice that would shape the rest of her life. Silence might save her body. Speech might cost it everything. She thought of her children asleep without her. She thought of the winter to come. She thought of the iron bridle, waiting somewhere behind the walls, patient and unfeeling. And still she spoke. "I repent only that truth is treated as sin." The room went very still. The magistrate sighed, as if disappointed. Then you leave us no choice. As they led her away, Margaret finally understood the true power of the world she lived in. It was not the iron, not the law, not even the men who enforced it. It was a simple, terrifying fact that a woman's voice, once raised, could never be taken back, only punished. And the punishment she was about to learn was never meant for her alone. They fitted the bridle at dawn. Margaret had not slept. The cell beneath the Guildhall was narrow and damp, its stone walls slick with centuries of despair. Rats skittered in the corners, bold as magistrates, unafraid of her wakeful eyes. She had spent the night rehearsing silence, testing it, measuring it, only to discover that silence, too, could scream inside the mind. The jailer came with the light, keys clanking like a cruel melody. He did not speak to her. Men rarely did when they intended harm. Words implied recognition. He led her up the steps into the courtyard where the morning air cut sharp and clean, as if the world itself wished to look innocent. The bridle lay on a table. Up close, it was worse than memory. Iron bands curved to cradle the skull, pitted with rust and old stains. Inside, a flat metal bit jutted forward, narrow and smooth, designed to rest on the tongue. Not cut it, not pierce it, but punish it with pressure until even thought became agony. "This will teach you," the magistrate said, arriving with 2 clerks and a crowd already gathering at the gate. A woman's tongue is a dangerous thing. Margaret wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, to tell them how many men's tongues had starved families, started wars, damned souls from pulpits. But the irony tasted bitter, and she held her breath as they lifted the iron toward her face. When it closed around her head, the world narrowed. The first pain was not sharp. It was intimate. The bit pressed down, forcing her tongue against the floor of her mouth until her jaw ached from holding itself closed. Saliva pooled instantly, hot and humiliating, and she felt the first tremor of panic ripple through her chest. They locked it. A murmur rose from the crowd. Some faces were avid, hungry for the spectacle. Others looked away, shame flickering like a shadow that passed too quickly to matter. Margaret searched for one face in particular. William stood at the edge of the courtyard, arms folded, expression fixed into something resembling righteousness. He did not look at her mouth. He watched her eyes. "This is what you wanted," she thought, the words beating uselessly against iron. They fastened a rope to the bridle and led her through the streets. York had never felt so large. Every step echoed. The stones bruised her feet through thin soles, and the iron dragged her head downward, forcing her gaze on the road ahead. Children pointed. A woman crossed herself. Someone threw a crust of bread that struck her shoulder and fell into the mud. Margaret stumbled once, and a sudden movement drove the bit harder into her tongue. White pain burst behind her eyes, stealing her breath. She made a sound then, not a scream, not a word, but something animal and broken that sent a ripple of unease to the onlookers. "Quiet." The jailer snapped, yanking the rope. She learned quickly. Every motion carried consequence. Every misstep was punished immediately and without appeal. This, she realized dimly, was a lesson they wished her to teach others. Obedience was not an idea. It was a reflex carved into flesh. At the market square, they made her stand. The magistrate read the charge aloud. Margaret Hale, found guilty of scolding, defiance, and disobedience to her lawful husband. The words rang hollow against the iron that rendered her incapable of reply. "This punishment is for correction," he continued, voice smooth. "Let all women who see her learn restraint." Margaret scanned the crowd again. She saw her neighbor Alice, eyes brimming with tears she did not dare shed. Alice had once confided bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, whispers of nights she survived by staying silent. Now she clutched her shawl tight, lips pressed together, absorbing the lesson as intended. Margaret wanted to tell her not to learn it. Time stretched. Minutes became an eternity measured in throbs of pain and a relentless pressure of metal. Saliva spilled down her chin. Her neck burned from holding itself rigid. The humiliation seeped deeper than the iron, settling into her bones. And yet, something unexpected happened. She endured. With every passing moment, the crowd's attention shifted. Spectacle grew dull. Some wandered away. Others began to fidget, discomfort creeping in where satisfaction had been promised. This was not the swift justice they enjoyed. It lingered. It forced them to watch a human being remain standing under deliberate cruelty. A boy tugged his mother's sleeve. Why can't she speak? The woman hesitated. Because she spoke before. Margaret fixed her eyes on the boy, pouring everything she could not say into that look. Confusion gave way to something else. Unease, perhaps even understanding. William had stopped watching. He stared at the ground now, jaw tight, as though the stones themselves accused him. When at last they removed the bridle, her tongue was numb, swollen, useless. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, the world spinning violently. The iron was placed back on the table, impassive and ready for its next lesson. Let her go, the magistrate said. She will remember. They were wrong about that. Margaret did remember, but not as they intended. As Alice helped at her feet and guided her home, Margaret understood something fundamental had shifted. Silence had been forced upon her body, but it had carved clarity into her mind. This punishment had not corrected her. It had revealed the truth beneath the law. Obedience was demanded not because women were wrong, but because they might be right. And iron, she knew now, could bruise flesh, but it could also forge resolve. The question was how long such resolve could survive in a world determined to crush it. Margaret did not speak for 3 days. Her tongue throbbed, swollen and tender, each attempted movement sending a reminder of iron into her skull. But the greater silence came from somewhere deeper. Words gathered behind her teeth like trapped birds, frantic and restless, yet she dared not release them. Not yet. William mistook this for victory. He moved through the house with the quiet confidence of a man restored to his proper place. He ate without complaint. He slept without turning away. He told neighbors, with practiced humility, that the punishment had been necessary, that he prayed Margaret would now be more peaceable. Margaret listened. Listening had once been survival, now it became strategy. From her stillness, she observed how power truly moved through their world. Not loudly, not honestly, but sideways, through whispers exchanged between men at alehouses and women at wells. She heard how another woman, Joan Fletcher, had been warned by her husband after witnessing Margaret's humiliation. How Alice had stopped speaking altogether, even to her own children. Fear, Margaret realized, spread faster than truth. On the 4th night, she finally spoke. It was not to William. The children slept, curled like questions she did not know how to answer. William snored, heavy and careless, certain the matter closed. Margaret wrapped her shawl tight and stepped into the night. Alice's door opened without a knock. They sat by the hearth, embers glowing low. The house hushed with the kind of caution that had become second nature to women. Margaret's voice, when she used it, was soft and deliberate. Each word weighed. They wanted me to be an example, she said, so we must choose what they learn. Alice shook her head, terror flashing across her face. They'll kill you. No, Margaret replied. They need us alive, silent, afraid. Alice looked down at her hands, knuckles white. Then what can we do? Margaret placed her own scarred hand over Alice's. What we have always done, but together. Over the following weeks, something subtle began to shift. Margaret did not argue with William again, not openly. Instead, she let him speak, let him believe himself unquestioned. But when he lied about money, she remembered. When he drank away wages, she noted who supplied the ale. When he boasted of authority, she measured its limits. And she spoke quietly, at the well, at the market, in kitchens where doors were closed and voices dropped low. She told her story without dramatics, without accusation, just facts, iron, pain, witnesses who had turned away. Other women added their own truths. Bruises hidden by linen, coin withheld, threats spoken just softly enough to deny. One by one, the silence that had protected cruelty began to fracture, not loudly, not dangerously, but persistently. It was dangerous work. A word misplaced could summon iron again. Margaret knew this better than anyone. She taught the others how to speak without being heard, to ask questions instead of making claims, to let men repeat themselves until the ugliness of their words stood naked in the air. The men noticed, eventually. William felt it first. A change in tone, a hesitation, the way Margaret's eyes no longer flinched, even when her mouth remained closed. He accused her of coldness, of distance. She answered him carefully, politely, never crossing the line that had once destroyed her. That restraint unsettled him more than defiance ever had. The magistrate heard rumors of wives gathering too often, of markets thick with listening. He dismissed them at first. Women had always talked. But something about the way men began to avoid certain topics in public made him uneasy. Control depended on predictability. And women, once predictable in their silence, were becoming something else entirely. Then Joan Fletcher disappeared. Her husband claimed she had run off. No one believed him, but no one said otherwise either. Margaret felt the loss like a blade under her ribs. Fear surged, thick and paralyzing. This was the cost. This was a reminder how far the world would go to remain unchanged. That night, Margaret nearly surrendered. She stood in her doorway, watching William sleep, thinking of iron and blood and the children who needed her alive more than brave. Silence beckoned, seductive and safe. Instead, she wrote. Words on paper carried danger of a different kind, but they also carried weight. Margaret wrote slowly, hand aching, recording names, incidents, patterns. She wrote not as an accusation, but as a record, something that could not be bent by memory or denied by convenience. She hid the pages beneath a loose floorboard. Weeks later, when the magistrate's clerk came asking questions, polite ones, cautious ones, Margaret understood the truth had begun to move beyond kitchens and wells. It had found cracks in the walls of authority. Still, the cost mounted. William grew suspicious. His authority, once unquestioned, felt suddenly fragile. He lashed out, not with fists, but with threats sharpened by fear. "You'll bring ruin on us," he hissed one night. "Do you want the bridle again?" Margaret met his gaze. "No," she said evenly. "I want a world where it's no longer needed." For the first time, he looked afraid, not of her words, but of what they had already begun to change. And change, Margaret knew, was the most dangerous argument of all. The arrest came quietly. No shouts, no iron at first. Just a knock at dawn and two men standing in the threshold with faces trained into practice neutrality. William lingered behind them, pale and rigid, his authority shrinking into something brittle and desperate. "The magistrate wishes to speak with your wife," one of the men said. Margaret kissed her children before William could object. She did not rush. Fear still lived in her chest, but it no longer ruled her movements. She had lived through iron. What remained was clarity. The Guildhall felt smaller than before, less imposing. Or perhaps she had grown. They questioned her for hours, not about arguments or disobedience, but about meetings, names, who had spoken to whom. Margaret answered carefully, truthfully, but never fully. She understood now that justice was not a blade you swung. It was a pressure you applied until something gave way. At last, the magistrate leaned back in his chair. "You have caused unrest." "I have recorded it," Margaret replied. The clerk paused mid-scratch of his quill. The magistrate's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Margaret reached beneath her shawl and placed the papers on the table. The room shifted. These were not pleas, not rumors, not hysterics easily dismissed. They were dates, witnesses, repeated patterns of harm, written plainly, relentlessly. The language of administration. turned back on itself. You accuse the law, the magistrate said slowly. I use it, Margaret answered. Outside, the bells of St. Olave's rang, not in warning but in time. The sound carried through the open window, into the square, where more people than usual had gathered. Word had traveled. It always did. The magistrate saw the crowd and calculated. Power, Margaret had learned, feared nothing more than exposure that could not be easily controlled. You were punished once, he said. Do not force us to repeat it. Margaret held his gaze. Then force yourselves to read. Silence stretched. Heavy, decisive. At last, he waved the clerk forward. We will review these claims. It was not justice, but it was a crack. They released her at dusk. Outside, Alice waited. So did others. No cheering, no triumph, just hands reaching out, steadying, human. Margaret understood then that change did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived like dawn, slow, undeniable, reshaping everything it touched. William did not speak to her that night, nor the next. His authority had depended on unquestioned certainty. Now doubt had entered the house, and it did not ask permission. Margaret did not need to argue with him any more. The silence between them had changed shape. It no longer belonged solely to fear. Weeks passed. The scold's bridle was not used again that year, not because the law had vanished, but because its application had become complicated. Watched, measured, power, once observed, behaved differently. Margaret continued to write, not to inflame, but to remember. She taught others how to do the same. Records multiplied quietly, stored beneath floors, inside loaves of bread, stitched into hems. History, she understood, was not written by the loudest voices, but by the ones that endured. Years later, when Margaret's hair had begun to gray and her children spoke with an ease she had never known, the bridle was removed from the Guildhall wall. Some said it had rusted beyond use. Others said it had become an embarrassment. Margaret never asked. She walked past the empty hook once, feeling the ghost of iron where it had once pressed. Pain had taught her something crucial. Suffering alone changes nothing. But suffering witnessed, recorded, and shared, measured carefully against truth, could bend even iron laws. The moral was not that silence was safety, nor that speech was harmless. It was that a woman's voice, when stripped of rage and sharpened by resolve, became something far more dangerous than argument. It became evidence. And evidence, once it exists, has a way of surviving long after fear has lost its grip.